Dialectics of Negativity, a psychoanalytic argument for the integration of pessimism. This academic text explores the concept of pessimism through a psychoanalytic lens, arguing that pessimism represents an acknowledgement of the negative and is a prerequisite lens for any critical observation of nature. Nonetheless, the lens has been objectified in psychological and mainstream narratives and has been subject to splitting. Splitting is the concept defined by Klein as a paranoid schizoid defense against anxieties created by the death drive, symptomatized by the failure to recognize the object as a whole. What is felt internally can't be accepted and is thus projected onto an external object. An omnipotent sense of control over this object is also installed to further stave off anxiety. As the internal feeling is cast out and not considered as being part of the self, both the self and the external world, used as defensive furniture, are psychically diminished. The external object is conceived of as a part object, so the assumption can be maintained that it is either good or bad, loved or hated. In the paranoid schizoid position, the object cannot be seen as a unitary entity, divested of both good and bad, love or hated. But given suitable conditions for psychical maturation and growth, the paranoid schizoid position is supplanted by the depressive position, wherein the subject is able to perceive the dual aspect of the object and feel love towards it. The depressive position is the recognition of the subject as a whole. Its complexity conjures a depressive anxiety in us, as we feel guilt for having split the object. The Dictionary of Kleinian Thought unambiguously describes the psychical progression of this step, stating that the ego capacities enlarge and the world is more richly and realistically perceived. Omnipotent control diminishes and external reality is felt as more real. In line with this perspective, I would suggest reading Riche's 2017 Three Essays on Fascism as a depressive position account. In a rampant defense against the reality pessimism provokes sight of, it is subject to splitting, cast aside as detrimental because it conjures the abject in us. Pessimism weighs heavily on our facticity and undermines the fantasies we hold about our transcendence by imposing the reality principle. The reality principle essentially highlights our impotence and limitations and deflates the infantile sense of omnipotence. Kristeva describes the abject as the breakdown of usual meaning and a threat to our understanding of reality. As such, we focus upon the Spinozan striving, objectifying the Speilreinian instinct of destruction. I suggest that pessimism is felt as an anchor on our infantile delusion, grounding us in our facticity, and we objectify any opposition to challenge our defensive systems or any intrusion of reality, to any reminder of the fact that we are not masters of our own homes, that we do not have dominion over even ourselves, and that we are subjected to laws of nature. As such, I argue that the objection of negativity perpetuates infantile self-delusion and splitting, whereas reckoning with it reintroduces what is an ontological primitive back into our symbolic system, reinstating a collective depressive function. Having married his theorizing of the libido with Sabina Spielrein's death instinct, Freud puts forward another law of instincts, a law of nature. That's a Freudian slip. The battle between eros and thanatos, or between the instinct of life and the instinct of death. Freud states that all life essentially consists of the struggle between these two instincts, which share world dominion. And it is this battle of the giants that our nursemaids try to appease with their lullaby about heaven. This desire to mitigate the pessimistic reality has transcended religion and is the dominant narrative in an age of conformist psychology, manufactured to optimize the exploitability of the populace by holding up a possibility that one must strive for, or feel guilty for not having attained, and projects condemnation onto fellow failures who we perceive to have also failed. This narrative ignores the detrimental externality of its false promises and the stigmatization of the less exploitable. This insipid optimism has created a value system which subjugates authenticity, individuality, and the overtly unfortunate. Schopenhauer has a quote which highlights the essence of my argument in this section, where he speaks about a shared reality. The quote is as follows: "The conviction that the world, and therefore man too, is something which really ought not to exist, is in fact calculated to instill in us indulgence towards one another. For what can be expected of beings placed in such a situation as we are? From this point of view, one might indeed consider that the appropriate form of address between man and man ought to be not monsieur, sir, but fellow sufferer, companion in misery. However strange this may sound, it corresponds to the nature of the case, makes us see other men in a true light, and reminds us of what are the most necessary of all things: tolerance, patience, forbearance, and charity, which each of us needs and which each of us therefore owes." So, towards a negative discourse. Foucault suggested that discourse is used to power society, and that a phenomenon needs to be subjugated by language in order to use it adequately. Hoffman suggests that without providing specific parameters of meaning, an idea can be manipulated. So, what is pessimism? Pessimism is a term used by Rousseau in 1795 and is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as the tendency to see the worst of things or believe that the worst will happen. In essence, a general dispositional tendency to expect negative outcomes. However, within academic psychology, there is some ambiguity and elasticity around its definition. Ayani, in 2018, suggests that there is no conclusive operationalization of optimism or pessimism. Historical studies have concentrated on pessimism in the form of hopelessness and opposed it to optimism. While optimism and pessimism were traditionally measured as a single binary structure, King and Belkin suggest that most modern research views optimism and pessimism as two separate but related constructs. Although this is a step in the right direction, most modern research now consider pessimism solely as a schema which negatively affects information processing. Norum and Cantor in 1986 strove to broaden the view of pessimism, questioning this one-sided view and looking for the subjective utility of pessimism in the individual's heuristic. In doing so, they coined the term defensive pessimism, which they found guarded its proponents against anxiety through reducing expectation. I would like to disabuse utility of overtly positive connotations. I think of utility in a similar way to wonder or dimensionality. If I think of Schopenhauer or Zizek or Risha, they have utilized their pessimism to write and to think, opposing it to the monocular assumption that it only devours possibility. I am standing on the shoulders of Nietzsche's distinction in The Birth of Tragedy, 1886, where he differentiates between what he terms pessimism of weakness and pessimism of strength. The former represents the conventional understanding of pessimism provided earlier, while the latter Nietzsche described as being a courageous stance towards one's reality, the negation of denial. The Nietzschean distinction points to the utility of applying negativity. It doesn't shun its existence, it factors negativity into the equation. In this, it highlights that pessimism is neither a singular construct nor a purely defensive construct, and that this blanket use of the term in psychological studies as hopeless and negative impacts on information processing does violence to the effective dimensionality it holds. I give an example of this, where Ogden in 1992 criticized the classical conception of the paranoid schizoid to depressive movement, arguing that the notion that the movement was undertaken once ignored the fact that we regress and fail and can become complacent. Ogden's pessimistic critique opposed the narrative of pure progression, opened the concept to further applicability, and destigmatized the inevitability of falling short. Nonetheless, I must concede that pessimism as a discourse of negativity is also open to be abused. Nonetheless, it frees the term from its monocular constraints. There is an enigmatic quote by the physician Oppenheimer, which always referenced detached from the rest of the dialogue it was part of. It stands alone, which forces each individual to reckon with it and interpret it upon themselves. Thus, you are thrust into an enterprise without any possibility of certainty or reassurance to conjure your own meaning. I would like to suggest there is something patently pessimistic about the quote, a bleak recognition met by a bleak confrontation with it. The quote is as follows: "It is perfectly obvious that the whole world is going to hell. The only possible chance that it might not is that we do not attempt to prevent it from doing so." The quote suggests to me that the inevitability of entropy and decay must be observed with a reverence which facilitates grace, as opposed to maniacally fighting at the controls of a plane that has lost its wings in a futile attempt to induce it to glide. The quote works on numerous levels, psychologically about the wages of projection and splitting. To face the world going to hell from the neutrality of the depressive position would be to recognize the cost and benefit of any possible conclusion. This would negate the philosophical issue of creating a thesis to combat the end, which will lead to an antithesis from an inevitable other, which only perpetuates the cycle of entropy in the gaze of activism. As a physicist, Oppenheimer would have been well placed to recognize the paradoxes of action in the subjective interference of the observer, in which the observer metaphysically agitates an outcome, as well as Newton's second law, that of an equal opposite reaction. Again, a reference to the Hegelian dialectic, which looks to me like a perpetual trauma response to the overlooked destructive inevitability of creating. What happens to the dust that the sculptor bears? This dust is the possibility Neville Chamberlain couldn't conceive of when Hitler claims that he would be satisfied after taking Czechoslovakia. This dust is the fragility in Icarus's wings, the consequence of Prometheus's hubris, and God's response to the Tower of Babel. There is a quote accredited to Aristotle: "I love Plato, but I love the truth more." The kind of notion that is synonymous now with red pill thinking, a decentering akin to the Copernican revolution. The Oppenheimer quote has that feel to it, that of a sobering truth which is cutting in its declaration. This is also, in my interpretation, the essence of negative psychoanalysis, as an academic assault on an infantile narrative and an insidious didactic tool with the capacity to assist pockets of academics to integrate a pessimistic lens. Thank you.